Numbers, the 27th chapter. I'm going to be reading from the New Living Translation of the Scriptures, beginning with verse 1. One day a petition was presented by the daughters of Zelophehad, Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. Their father Zelophehad was a descendant of Hepher, son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, son of Joseph. These women stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the tribal leaders, and the entire community at the entrance of the tabernacle. Our father died in the wilderness, they said. He was not among Korah's followers who rebelled against the Lord. He, being Korah, died because of his own sin. But our father had no sons. Why should the name of our father disappear from his clan just because he had no sons? Give us property along with the rest of our relatives. So Moses brought their case before the Lord. The claim of the daughters of Zelophehad is legitimate. You must give them a grant of land along with their father's relatives. Assign them the property that would have been given to their father. And the Lord replied to Moses, and give the following instructions to the people of Israel. If a man dies and has no son, then give his inheritance to his daughters. And if he has no daughter either, transfer his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, give his inheritance to his father's brothers. But if his father has no brothers, give his inheritance to the nearest relative in his clan. This is a legal requirement for the people of Israel, just as the Lord commanded Moses. Thus far, the word of the Lord. You must be seated. These women stood before Moses, Eleazar, the priest, the tribal leaders, and the entire community at the entrance of the tabernacle. Our father died in the wilderness, they said. He was not among Korah's followers who rebelled against the Lord. He died because of his own sin. But he had no sons. Why should the name of our father disappear from his clan just because he had no sons? Give us property along with the rest of our relatives. I just want you to look at somebody, just say bold. Bold, 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 bold. That's what I want to deal with today. Last Sunday, 4 congresswomen were thrust in the forefront of our attention due to their being the most recent targets of our president's attacks. There should be no doubt that the president's remarks were racist and personal. The days that have followed, he, along with the communications machine, have sought to deflect the matter by introducing policy differences. Regardless of policy difference, this level of vitriol coming from the White House should never be condoned. And perhaps someone should send a memo that possessing the bully pulpit of the presidency does not give one the license to be a bully. Since last Sunday, he has engaged in attacks that are racist, xenophobic, and misogynistic. And it is striking that his most virulent of attacks are reserved for women. Regardless of their race, his most energetic thrusts are against women. Where's all the bluster and bravado when it comes to Vladimir Putin? Where is this testosterone when it comes to a proven adversary of the United States who constantly seeks to disrupt and destroy American democracy? He has called 4 congresswomen hate-filled extremists while courting and claiming the support of white nationalists and white supremacists. It's a dark time in our country. And besides being racist, xenophobic, and misogynistic, the president's suggestion that those who are discontent with conditions and status of America should go back to the countries from which they came, that is nonsensical for one simple fact. American progress has and will continue to depend upon those whose discontent forces positive change. America began as an expression of discontent. It was revolutionary discontent that led Crispus Attucks to fight and die in the Revolutionary War. The place of discontent is weaved throughout our nation's history of progress. If those who were discontent with conditions in America had left the country, what type of country would we have? And who would remain in the country? We would not have strong labor unions who collectively bargain for workers' rights. We wouldn't have women, regardless of race, would be limited to a life in the kitchen with no rights. The environment would have no protections. Children would be subject to sweatshops and child slavery, and people of color would still be excluded from Social Security and veterans' benefits. With no women, no children, and no people of color, who would be left in America? And if you seek to answer that question, well, that one group believes that America is rightfully theirs and theirs alone, we beg to differ. America was built on the backs and blood and tears of those enslaved. The economies of both the North and the South were built upon slave labor. Banking, insurance, commodities, textiles, shipping were all built on the backbone of enslavement. And we who are their descendants have as much ownership of this country as anyone else. And those immigrants who have come into this country and have done so legally have as much ownership of this country as anybody else. And we aren't going anywhere. We will continue to critique, to challenge, to place under scrutiny, and pronounce judgment. Because that's how the nation progresses. 3 of the 4 congresswomen, known as the Squad, a name first applied by Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, were relatively unknown to most of us. We didn't even know their names. But the president's actions thrust them into the public consciousness. People who never knew them now know of them. And can I say parenthetically that God will often use somebody else's actions to push you forward. With the reporting on Sunday, the nation waited to hear how this group would respond. I am the father of 2 girls, and so I was particularly curious about how these women would respond after being attacked by the leader of the free world. And on Monday evening, they responded with dignity, discipline, clarity, and courage. I felt a father's pride for daughters. Not that I agree with every position that they have, but I was proud of them refusing to accept bullying, to step up and exhibit courage. I watched all 4 of them take the podium and address the issue before the nation. And we need to understand, while the attack against them was a personal one, it has implications beyond them, because it bespeaks a disposition and an attitude towards people of color and women that harkens back to the darkest of times in our nation and in the history of the world. In the history of our nation, it is reminiscent of the white supremacy and white nationalism that undergirded antebellum slavery, the Civil War, and Jim Crow segregation. In the history of the world, it is reminiscent of German Nazism and Italian fascism, which were the preconditions for the Holocaust and World War II. And each one of those came up and spoke and challenged the darkness that confronts our nation and indeed our world. With white supremacist, nationalist, xenophobic, and misogynistic sentiments openly and boldly being spouted and touted at the highest levels of government, There is a need for women and men of faith and conscience to openly and boldly be seen and heard, critiquing, refuting, and pronouncing judgment in the clearest of terms. This is not the time for acquiescence, compliance, reluctance, or timidity. With equal, if not more force, voices must be heard and stances must be seen, resisting and rejecting my God, let me get it right. Demagoguery coming from wherever it is. There's got to be a clear sound that says this is not the standard for our nation, and we've got to be bold in our declaration. We need boldness. It's time to have some backbone and some spine. When I think about the boldness that I saw in those 4 women on Monday, I was reminded of another squad of women who were equally as bold. The story before us is set within the context of the promise God made to Abraham beginning in Genesis chapter 12, verses 6 and 7. God makes this promise when they arrive in Canaan. Abram traveled through the land as far as Shechem. There he set a camp beside the oak of Moreh. At that time, the area was inhabited by the Canaanites. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your descendants. That's the promise that God made to Abraham. Fast forward 400 years later, the books of Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Joshua provide information and accounts of the regulations for and the obtaining of the land promised by God. Chapter 26 provides a census of the number of male troops that Israel had prior to the entering of Canaan. The census was not of the women and children, it was just of the male troops. And the reason why that's important, because Deuteronomy 25 verses 5 through 10 addresses the matter of clan and family, where the husband or father dies with no male heirs. The brother of that man would then marry the widow in order that a male heir might be produced to continue the name of the family and hold ownership of the property. The land would be given for the perpetual benefit of the family from generation to generation. It's within this context that now Numbers 27 emerges, and we are told of these daughters of a man by the name of Zelophehad. They were the great-great-great-great-granddaughters of Joseph. They are the tribe of Manasseh. And they stand before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the tribal leaders, and the entirety of the community of Israel to present a concern that they have. Now, the reason why the writer lets you know each of the groups that are present is to let you know they're not doing anything in the closet. This is not a private conversation with Moses. This is not a meeting of just the leadership of Israel. This is a statement in front of everybody. And it's unusual and groundbreaking because the normative practice was that the concerns of a person, family, or tribe would be brought before Moses by a member of the family. However, in this instance, there is no male to stand on their behalf. And with no male to stand on their behalf, the daughters choose to stand not just before Moses, but before everybody, and to stand for themselves. Friends, if you want to know what type of boldness we need now, we need boldness to show up in difficult places. Just there showing up to address the community, that was groundbreaking. It was their boldness, it was their courage that prompted them to do so. Friends, in many cases, it takes boldness and courage just to show up, to make your presence known, felt, seen, heard in areas where you are non-existent, unwelcome, discounted, marginalized, underrepresented, and misunderstood. That takes boldness and courage to continuously be the first and often the only of your kind. Requires an internal strength and confidence. It was that boldness and courage that empowered Belva Lockwood to be the first female to argue a case before the all-male Supreme Court of the United States. And just her showing up was disruptive and transformative. Can I let you in on a secret? Never underestimate the power of simply showing up. Because showing up is the precondition for transformation. If you don't show up, nothing transformative can happen. But when you show up, transformation is set in motion. Just by people like Ruby Bridges showing up at William Frantz Elementary School in Louisiana, James Meredith showing up at Ole Miss, Harvey Gantt showing up at Clemson, Charlene Hunter Galt showing up at Carolina, Dorothy Counts showing up at Harding High, Jackie Robinson showing up in the Dodgers uniform. Just them showing up, transformation took place. Things could and would never be the same, and that's why there's so much resistance to them just showing up, because as long as they're not seen, nothing can happen. But when they showed up, transformation happened. It happened in the mind, it happened in the heart, it happened in the spirit. Transformation begins when people of boldness show up. And as a child of God, you need to know the power of you just showing up. God endows you with his spirit so that when you show up, things shift. Just your occupying space that wasn't previously occupied by anyone like you is a shift, because when you show up, darkness loses its grip on the space, because you are the light of the world. When you show up, falsehood loses its dominance, because you come bearing truth and living in truth. When you show up, evil loses its confidence, because you are the righteousness of God. We need boldness just to show up. Tell your neighbor, you got to be bold. You got to be bold. We need boldness just to show up. But then also we need boldness to speak out against difficult challenges. These daughters, they show up, but they show up not just to be seen, but also to be heard. There's something that they must say for themselves with no one to speak for them. They choose to speak for themselves. They must speak out because something has to change. The alternative of the status quo was a non-starter for them. They could not accept things being the way that they were. And they could not accept nobody speaking to their concerns and of their experiencing the price of lack of advocacy. With no one to speak up for them, they had the boldness to speak up for themselves, to voice their concerns, to advocate for their position, to put a face to an issue. God not only gave them boldness to show up, but also boldness to speak out. While there is a message that your showing up gives, there's another message that your speaking out provides. And both are necessary. You got to show up and you got to speak out, because you got to give voice to your own concerns. The history of the progress of our nation has been due to men and women with the boldness to speak out, to challenge the status quo, to give voice in the absence of voicelessness, and to put a face on the issue. In the midst of the Reagan administration ignoring AIDS and HIV, Ryan White and Magic Johnson and Arthur Ashe spoke out and became voices and faces of AIDS that could not be ignored. By sitting down and refusing to get up, Rosa Parks spoke out and became the face that could not be ignored. Martin and Malcolm and Medgar and Stokely and Fannie Lou and Angela and Huey and others spoke out and were the faces and voices that could not be ignored. Winnie and Nelson and Stephen Biko and Desmond Tutu and others spoke out against apartheid and were the voices and faces that could not be ignored. By just showing up, the daughters then spoke out about the injustice and inequity that they perceived. With no male heirs, they say, why should their father's name disappear from his clan? Why should what is rightfully theirs by way of birthright go to another family simply because they are daughters who don't have a brother? God's promise to Abraham did not mention male or female descendants. God just said, to your descendants. Why were they now adding another distinction that God did not have. And therefore they request a share of the property that would have gone to their father had their father been alive. They raised the issue of justice and equity. They challenged the inherent fairness of the distribution of the property only when there is a male heir. It takes boldness to raise questions, especially in the midst of those who benefit from things remaining the same. The daughters were raising the question in the midst of those who would benefit from things just staying where they are. There were cousins and uncles who would benefit from things remaining the same, because if things remained the same, the land would go to one of those uncles or one of those cousins. And while that was so, the daughters spoke out anyway and asked for their share of their property. They offer a transformative agenda. We need boldness to set forth a transformative agenda. Just look at somebody and say, things can't stay the same. The daughters offered an alternative to what was. It was a transformative agenda. It was a bold step. God grants boldness to speak out and challenge injustice in the status quo and to point to a transformative agenda. In other words, it's not just enough to talk about what's wrong, but then you've got to be able to offer another picture of what could and should be right. These daughters walk in the realm of the prophetic, who critique the status quo, the dominant culture, and they now provide an alternative vision and understanding. They speak of another way, a better way, a fairer way, a more just and inclusive way. In other words, the daughter says, when it comes to paternal inheritance, daughters are just as deserving as sons. Daughters are no less descendants of their fathers. Daughters have no less claim to fathers and to what belongs to fathers. Daughters are certainly more immediate to fathers than uncles and nephews. They speak of a transforming way that you think about daughters in relation to their fathers, in relation to the legacy of their fathers, in relation to the continuation of the family's history and heritage, in the ability of daughters to manage and exercise custody over the generational inheritance. They say, let the girls rise up. It takes boldness to critique what is and to communicate what can be or what should be in the arena of those who benefit from what it is. It took boldness for Moses to go before Pharaoh and to demand release of the people when Pharaoh and Egypt were benefiting from Hebrew bondage. It took boldness for Nathan to confront David and declare, thou art the man, when David was enjoying what he had with Bathsheba. It took boldness for Elijah to confront Ahab and Jezebel when they were enjoying, oppressing, and leading the people into idolatry. It took boldness for Daniel to confront Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, and Darius. And it took boldness for John the Baptist to confront Herod. It took boldness for Patrick Henry to speak out and declare, give me liberty or give me death. It took boldness for Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, John Brown, William Lloyd Garrison, William Lloyd Steele, Harriet Tubman, and others to confront the evil of antebellum slavery and propose a transformative agenda of the abolition of slavery everywhere. It took boldness for Samuel Gompers and others to speak out for the cause of workers and offer a transformative agenda through the formation of the Federation of Organized Trade and Labor Unions, which was the precursor to the American Federation of Labor. It took boldness for Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and others to speak out against the disenfranchisement of women and offer a transformative agenda of women being fully enfranchised in the American experiment of democracy. It took boldness for Lewis Hine and Owen Lovejoy and Alexander McElway and others to speak out against the abusive and oppressive treatment of children and form the National Child Labor Committee to set forth a transformative agenda for children and work. You got to have some boldness to offer an alternative to those satisfied with the current arrangements and the benefits that they accrue. It takes boldness because it's risky. Tell your neighbor, it's dangerous business. These daughters speak out, and they don't know what Moses, what Eleazar, what the tribal leaders or the whole community might do in response to them. They could be rejected. They could be ridiculed. They could be persecuted. They could be ostracized. Nevertheless, they took the risk of vulnerability and rejection, because it's risky when you challenge the status quo. It's risky when you critique the dominant ideology. It's risky swimming against the tide. And it's risky not towing the company line. It's risky not going along to get along. Those 4 congresswomen, they took the risk of running for office and of being elected. They've taken the risk of speaking their minds and views in the marketplace of ideas. And while I may not agree with everything that they propose, I do appreciate the boldness that it takes to speak out. Because, friends, you place yourself at risk of being misunderstood, mischaracterized, misperceived, falsely accused, physically threatened, socially isolated, politically marginalized. You and those whom you love are vulnerable to hateful and spiteful things said and posted and done without warning. And for what reason? You dare to serve the public good for a public with short-term memory and a sense of entitlement. Who in their right mind other than feeling that you are called to do that would put themselves in that type of position? Showing up and speaking out to offer a transformative agenda is risky business, because you become a threat to the status quo. Oh, never underestimate how much of a threat you are. And if you are a Christian, you need to understand you're a double threat. You're not just a threat because of what you provide in the natural. You're also a threat by what you provide in the spiritual. As long as you are outside of the circle of faith, you are not a threat unto the prince of the air. But when you said, I'm going to get myself together, I'm going to hook up with God, I'm going to get serious for Jesus, that's when you really became a risk. That's when you really became a threat. That's when another bullseye was put on your back, because now you have the potential to rearrange and transform and disrupt and pull down and build back up. These daughters, they show up and they speak out and they suggest a transformative agenda, and they do it in public. They don't ask Moses for a private meeting. They do it in public. Now that places Moses in a precarious position, because Moses knows what Deuteronomy says, but he also knows the promise that God made to Abraham. And there seems to be tension between the two. Deuteronomy 25 says it goes to a male heir. God's promise to Abraham was, to your descendants, regardless of gender. And here are these girls now demanding their share. What's Brother Moses going to do? Well, he does not send the matter back down to Eleazar, or he does not call a meeting with the tribal leaders. He does not put the matter up for public referendum to the entire community. He took their case to the only one who could really handle it. Took their case before God. God alone knows what to do with this. It's God's land, and these are God's people. And Moses demonstrates that we need bold action to be informed by God's perspective. The bold must recognize the need for divine guidance in the steps that must be taken. In other words, whatever bold move you make, you need to get some input from God so that your move is in alignment with his purpose and his plan. Proverbs 16:1 says, to humans belong the plans of the heart, but from the Lord comes the proper answer of the tongue. Proverbs 16:9, in their hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. Proverbs 19:21 says, many are the plans in a person's hearts, but it is the Lord's purpose that prevails. Bold action, if it's going to be sustainable and truly transformative, must be informed and shaped by God's revealed purpose and plan. That's why when Mordecai came to Esther and corrected Esther concerning the reason why she was in the palace, Esther then sent the message back to Mordecai saying, have all the Jews fast for me for 3 days and for 3 nights, because when I make this bold move, I need to be informed by God's purpose and God's plan. When Daniel was going to go before Nebuchadnezzar to interpret a dream that nobody could interpret, Daniel requested his partners Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to pray to the God of heaven to show mercy upon him and to reveal Nebuchadnezzar's dream to him that they might be spared. Bold action requires being informed and shaped by God's purpose and by God's plan. My God, the real power of the civil rights movement was the fact that it was informed by God. That's why before they would do anything, they'd meet in a church and they would have a prayer meeting and they would call on the Lord, because they understood that in order to have the impact that they desire, in order to have the boldness that they must exhibit, and in order to be able to touch the conscience of the nation the way that it needs to be touched, it would need to be God with them and God through them and God working upon the hearts and minds of those who were watching. Friends, I need to remind us that it's always by way of prayer that God shifts things in the nation. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves, seek my face and pray, turn from their wicked ways, then will I hear from heaven. I'll forgive their sin. I'll heal their land. God responds to Moses. Listen to what God says. The claim of the daughter is legitimate. You must give them a grant of land along with their father's relatives. Assign them the property that would have been given to their father. Now that would have been good enough, but God goes further. God then says, and give the following instructions to the people of Israel. If a man dies and has no son, then give his inheritance to his daughters. And if he has no daughter either, transfer his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, give his inheritance to his father's brothers. But if his father has no brothers, give his inheritance to the nearest relative in his clan. This is a legal requirement for the people of Israel, just as the Lord commanded Moses. Now, the daughters showed up for their stuff. Right? But God extends the judgment beyond them and makes it a precedent to be upheld for all people. In other words, because of their showing up and their speaking out, generations that follow would also be covered. Because what God wants us to understand is their boldness wasn't just transformative, it was transgenerational. Its impact was far beyond them and their generation. The daughters that succeed them will benefit as a result of their showing up and their speaking out. Our boldness impacts future generations. When you seek and then act upon God's perspective, you step into something that is beyond you. You see, the matter of the inheritance of the land, it preceded them through the promise to Abraham, and it would succeed them them through their descendants. And therefore, their showing up and speaking out in the time that they did was tied to that which came before them and tied to what would come after them. Understand this: God generated boldness is never just for the present moment. It's designed to impact and affect future moments. What God does through you is designed to impact and affect others who are with you and those who come after you. The boldness of Frederick Douglass and others was not just for themselves, but it was for the generations that would come after them. Their desire for a transformative agenda that benefited multiple generations to come. And well might we thank God for the sacrifices of men and women who, showing up and speaking out, set the conditions for us to experience blessing. They're showing up at segregated lunch counters, set the conditions for us to show up. They're showing up at the Edmund Pettus Bridge and the streets of Birmingham, set the conditions for us to vote as we want. Well might we celebrate the lives of those who, showing up and speaking out before us, set the conditions for us to experience the blessing after them. Can we celebrate those freedom riders who showed up in the South in 1961 to protest segregated bus terminals, whites only restrooms, and lunch counters at bus terminals? Can we celebrate the freedom summer workers who showed up in Mississippi in 1964 to register Negroes to vote and to set up freedom schools for community organizing? Can we celebrate the nameless and faceless thousands who gave themselves, who suffered under water hoses, German shepherds, cross burnings, house bombings, church burnings, children being lynched so that we might enjoy the freedoms that we sadly take for granted? Can we celebrate those who showed up before so that we who come after might enjoy the blessings that we enjoy now? Now you understand why the enemy wants you to be scared and timid and acquiescent, because he understands that as long as you are timid and scared and acquiescent, he's got the future in his hand. But when you say, we're going to flip the script, we're going to change this thing, not just for ourselves, but for future generations. When we make up in our minds, my daughter is going to live in a freer place, my son is going to grow up in a better place, you got to have that type of bold. We need boldness. We need boldness. There's one more thing. Boldness has to be partnered with a patient faith to see the changes that we desire. The timing of the daughter's request is interesting because it precedes the actual conquest of land. This is before Moses has led them into the conquering of land on the east side of the Jordan River. And it's before Joshua has led them to conquer the land on the west side of the Jordan River. But they make their request in faith, believing God's promise to be true. And therefore, they request what they perceive to belong to them before any actual possession has occurred. They call things that are not as though they already were. It takes bold faith for you to request that which hasn't even taken place yet. And it takes a bold faith. In taking that stance of faith, they were committing themselves to waiting for whatever time it took for the land to be conquered and for the inheritance to be given. God developed a patient faith for them to receive that for which they asked. Because while the daughters made their request to Moses, they would not see the results until the time of conquest with Joshua. And they were willing to wait to see the lasting change for which they advocated. And in their time of waiting, they saw some die. In their time of waiting, they saw some battles fought. In their time of waiting, they saw some miracles of the Lord. They saw the Jordan River open, and they walked over on dry ground. They saw the walls of Jericho fall after just marching around the city for 7 days, and on the seventh day marching around 7 times, and on the seventh time issuing a shout, and the walls came tumbling down. They've seen God, my God, set the sun still and give them all the time that they needed in order to be victorious in battle. In their time of waiting, they saw the faithfulness of God, because God kept them for the time and the time for them. The boldness of your move must often be matched by a patient faith in waiting to see the change that you desire God to work out in your life. Because, friends, there is the time for the fulfillment of every purpose. In the fullness of time, God brings things to pass. In 1968, my God, a Jamaican-born woman, my God, who lived in New York, she ran, and she was the first black female to enter into the halls of Congress. And then in 1972, that same woman declared, I'm going to run for the presidency of the United States. Folks said the country is not ready for either a woman or a black person to occupy the Oval Office. Shirley Chisholm, she ran anyway. She was not successful, but she had a patient faith. And that patient faith and the example that she set caused Jesse Jackson to run in 1984 and in 1988. And though he did not win, it still set the stage for a patient faith, for a change to come. And then in 2008, a one-term senator from the state of Illinois with a funny name, Barack Hussein Obama. Who in the world is he? He dares to run. It's a bold move. We're not ready for a black man in the White House, but he ran anyway, and he won not just one term, he won both terms, because for every bold move, there's a time for fulfillment. I'm right there in the fullness of time. God made a bold move to show up in the form of a baby born of a virgin in a stable called Bethlehem. It was a bold move that threatened the status quo. Herod got the word that the prophecy has been fulfilled, that the King of the Jews has been born. So threatened was Herod that he issued an edict for all of the male children 2 years and younger in Bethlehem to be killed. But God said, the move that I make, I'll always protect it for the time that I have for it. And so God hid the bold move out in Egypt to fulfill the scriptures that said, out of Egypt have I called my son. And when Herod died, God brought Jesus back to Nazareth, where he grows up. And at the age of 30, the bold move shows up. Oh my God, shows up, and John the Baptizer declares, behold the Lamb of God that takes away the sins of the world. Jesus was God's bold move who showed up, and he spoke out. And whenever he showed up, transformation occurred. When he showed up, demons got nervous and asked, what do you want with us, Jesus? When he showed up, sickness had to vanish. When he showed up, things happened. When he spoke out, winds and waves obeyed his voice and were stilled. When he spoke out, the lame man picked up his bed and walked. When he spoke out, dead people came back to life. It was a bold move, but it was risky, and it left him vulnerable. But it was in his vulnerability that the purpose of God would be fulfilled. It was in his weakness that the boldness of God would be realized. Nobody would take his life. He lay it down willingly, and he had power to pick it up again. When the Roman soldiers came and Peter wanted to fight them and cut off their ears, Jesus said, we don't need none of that. I'm ready. I'm bold. I've got assurance. As a matter of fact, I prayed my way into this position. I prayed 3 times, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me, but nevertheless not my will, but thy will be done. And now Jesus has boldness to just show up. He shows up at Calvary and he speaks out there. He speaks, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He speaks out and says to a thief, today you'll be with me in paradise. He speaks out to his mother and says, woman, behold thy son, and son, behold thy mother. He speaks out and he gives up the ghost. But before he does, he says, Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit. They think that they've canceled the move when they put him in the grave. They think that this all over. His own followers are now depressed because they feel that all of their hopes have died. But there's something about God. God says, if I said it, I'll do it. If I spoke it, I'll bring it to pass. I'm not a man that I will lie. I will not even allow death to keep me from keeping my word. And so on the third day, just as Jesus said, if I be lifted up, I'll draw all men. He says, tear this body down. In 3 days, I'll raise it up again. And so on the third day, God raises Jesus from the dead with all power in his hand. And now Jesus lives forevermore. And now Jesus gives his people boldness. We have boldness to come before the throne of grace and obtain mercy and find grace to help in time of need. We have boldness to stand and declare, thus says the Lord. We have boldness to raise up a witness. We have boldness to let our light shine. We have boldness to live in truth and to walk in truth. We have boldness to raise a standard. We have boldness to call things the way that they are. We have boldness to walk by faith and not by sight. We have boldness to wait on the Lord because we know that he may not come when you want him, but when he comes, he will be on time. We have boldness to believe that our God is still in charge. We have boldness to believe that our God is still sovereign. We have boldness to believe that truth that's crushed to the ground will rise up again. We have boldness to believe that no lie can last forever. We have boldness to believe that good still overcomes bad. We have boldness to believe that love overcomes hatred. We have boldness to believe that righteousness overcomes wickedness. We have boldness to take our stand. Slap five with your neighbor and say, stand. Stand for holiness. Stand for righteousness. Stand for justice. Stand for equity. Stand for peace. Stand for power. And know that the Lord, your God, stands with you. Slap five with your neighbor and say, neighbor, I can take my stand because I know I'm not standing by myself. The Lord stands with me. The Lord has your backup. The Lord fights your battles. The Lord is with you. And why is the Lord with you? Why is the Lord fighting your battles? Why is the Lord making you strong? Tell your neighbor, it's for the Lord's glory. It's for the Lord's honor. It's for the Lord's praise. That's why every now and then you got to be able to say, and you got to say it in faith, mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He's loosed his faithful lightning by his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. And so I can say, glory, glory, glory. trial, in difficulty, in challenge, in perplexity. Glory!